Joining us right now is the former Deputy Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush and Fox News contributor Karl Rove. Karl, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
You bet. A little acrimonious there a few moments ago in the studio.
A little acrimonious because we're all trying to figure out...
Let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya together. Come on.
Kumbaya. We're all trying to figure out the relevance of the Consumer Financial Protection Office, Karl.
Well, look, Fowler is ignoring the Constitution of the United States, which establishes legislative powers, and the Consumer Protection Bureau is not funded by the Congress, thereby removing the authority of Congress to each year conduct oversight through the budget. And this is a dangerous precedent. There's no other federal agency that escapes funding from the government except the Federal Reserve, the independent Federal Reserve, and I do think it ought to be brought under the traditional means of having to come to Congress each year for its budget and to receive the approval of the Congress thereby.
But Karl, doesn't that
it was not, incidentally, a bipartisan vote. It was shoved down the throats of the Congress. There were like a handful.
But that's more than one is a bipartisan. We'll call it that. But either way, I mean, my problem with merging it back into the feds, then it sort of falls under this whole idea, this political umbrella. We saw the same thing happen with the FBI and Comey, where he was like, we're supposed to be independent of the federal government.
It is intensely... It's not being under control of Congress makes it intensely political, meaning the director of the Bureau. Let me finish, Fowler, let me finish, please. Don't just because you got the pink tie and the vest going on doesn't give you the right to interrupt me.
Go ahead, Karl, you got the floor.
And incidentally, pull the tie up. I can see your top button, man. It just ruins the look. Pull the tie up. Pull the tie up.
Karl, what do you want to say? You got the floor.
I want to say that it is unusual to have this agency separate from the Congress, and that therefore it's intensely political. The president appoints that director. Once they're approved, they have no responsibility to come to the Congress and be responsible for their actions. And we saw, particularly in some of their so-called investigations, they would not even cough up the data on which they were using to indict vast segments of our industry and our financial sector.
So here's I have one question.
All right, real quick, because we've got to move on to health care. Go ahead, Richard.
I have one question. So who will stand up for the students, right? Because clearly the student loan debt crisis is a huge problem. Betsy DeVos has chosen not to stand up for students by rolling back a lot of those protections.
Standing up for
She's
students.
rolled back so many protections that help students from predatory lending practices of unregulated student loan companies.
So you're sitting there telling us that you really think that she's against students?
I think she's against. I think she's against student loan debt holders. I will say that publicly.
Let me answer the question. The Consumer Protection Bureau can stand up for them even if it's under Congress. And look, Richard, I love how you're now excited about student loan debt because, after all, the Affordable Care Act, most people don't understand this, the Affordable Care Act nationalized student loan programs. If you want one with a federal guarantee, you got to get it from the government. They create the money by borrowing it. No, let me finish, Richard. Let me finish again. Don't keep interrupting me, man. Come on. So they borrow the money at 2%. From the Federal Reserve, money we don't have. They loan it to the students at just over 6%, and the 4% of interest that the government is making, the VIG that it's making on those student loans, goes to pay for the Affordable Care Act, $8 billion over 10 years. If you're really concerned about student loan debt, then maybe we ought to do something about redoing a loan program that is being used to fund the Affordable Care Act. Doesn't make any sense at all to me.
We don't want to dominate the conversation with this because it wasn't even on our agenda. By the way, are you seriously saying that the Trump administration is against students?
I am.
I mean, really?
I think they're against student loan debt holders. I think you could look at her rollback.
Let's move on to ObamaCare.
No, I'll just say the government's responsible for creating this problem in the first place.
I agree there, too.
And selling American students a lie that the more you pay for an education, even if it's borrowed money, it's somehow going to make you successful in this life. And they did it with housing as well. Student loans and housing. Government bureaucrats and lawmakers are the ones behind those bubbles and debacles.
And then there's bureaucracy in health care. Iowa is going to be the first state with no health insurance company willing to offer policies on the Affordable Care Act exchange. Karl, how urgent is the need to fix Obamacare becoming, and where do you see it right now? It's sitting in the Senate.
Well, look, let's be clear. There's no way to fix the Affordable Care Act without dramatically increasing the spending to, in essence, to bribe the insurers to give policies that they otherwise can't issue. So the Affordable Care Act, the exchanges on the Affordable Care Act are going to continue to get worse no matter what is done unless there's a huge infusion, and I mean huge infusion of money. We're spending almost the gross dollars as much as was anticipated under the Affordable Care Act for serving just more than half the number of people. That is to say, we're spending 2x per person as anticipated, and that ain't going to get better. So we need to begin to transition out of this into a more market-centered program in which there's competition and choice and a variety of plans, not one size fits all.
Karl, it's Kevin Kelly. I think you're hitting the nail on the head, but one of the things that's not talked about is how the CBOE completely misscored the Affordable Care Act and all the people signing up, so those numbers were completely bunk. And then you start looking at the new bill that's being proposed, and we're talking about 24 million uninsured people, 23 million uninsured, but that's directly because the CBOE misscored the Affordable Care Act. And so, I mean, what is your take on that?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And look, you don't need to go back to 2010 and find the difficulty with CBO scores. 3 years ago, the CBO updated its score and estimated that there would be over 20 million people in the exchanges this year. That's less than 3 years ago they made that estimate, and there are just over 11 million people in the program. And again, as I say, we're spending as much money as they anticipated with 20 million, but we're doing it with 11. So, yeah, absolutely. And one other thing that the CBO tends to do is it tends to underestimate the effect of competition. We saw this with the prescription drug benefit, which was private individuals' choice, consumer power. And what happened is the CBO estimated the cost would be $450 billion over 10 years. More people signed up. They signed up quicker. They used it more. And yet the cost is 40% less because that program was built around competition, consumer power, and choice. And the same thing is going to happen here. They say 20-some-odd million people, 24 million people will not have insurance. Now, some people, liberals, say, well, they're going to lose their insurance. No, these are people who are not going to have insurance because freed from having the penalty of up to 3% of their adjusted gross income taken from them for not having insurance, they're going to decide it ain't worth it for me to buy it. So what we need to do is incentivize them to buy insurance by allowing insurance to become more affordable, more reasonable, and more attractive to purchase.
All right, real quick before you go, Karl, they have 26 days left. Do you expect them to execute an agenda that President Trump has pushed? That means tax reform and health care reform.
I think they will get tax reform done, but it's going to take longer than between now and the July break. I think also it's going to take longer to get health care done, though there is a possibility of a vote before the July 4th recess. Last week I was picking up from people involved in the Senate discussions that they were feeling better about it, good about it, but they will not vote without a CBO score. In my opinion, is they're likely to get something of an agreement, maybe even some language by July 4th, but they're not going to have the CBO score, so it means they're going to come back later in July and vote on it.
All right, we'll leave it there, Karl. We'll be watching.